Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined once again by writer Chris Brookmyre. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
So, we're here to talk about the latest Jack Parlabane mystery, Quite Ugly One Evening, 30 years after his first appearance in Quite Ugly One Morning. Just a quick question: how many Jack Parlabane novels have been published?
This is the ninth.
And
There's
why?
also
Why is he a character that you return to? What is it about Parlabane that kind of has stayed with you over the years?
that's a really good question. I kind of saddled myself with him early on. I created a character that felt appropriate to the book that I was writing with the first one, in terms of the tone, and that I, I was reading a lot of American crime fiction, things like Carol Hyacin, and they didn't seem to mind having an investigative character who got a lot of quips and one-liners and was kind of like quite fun to be around. And at that time, early 90s, and prior to that, so many British investigating characters were really miserable, and they were no fun to be around on the page. So I thought I'll write someone who is more like the American model, and also slightly inspired by something like Ford Prefect and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But I did kind of make him a bit insufferable. Made him just too full of himself, and it worked all right in Quite Ugly One Morning. But I think I realised after a while he was too cartoonish to be useful in certain other situations. Obviously, it lends itself to the grotesque satire that is in the books. But I kept coming back to him. I think it's almost like many a writer or an artist, you want to keep doing the same thing till you get it right. So I started kind of reworking the character. So I had a bit of a hiatus from him, and then came back to him in Dead Girl Walking. And at that point, the Leveson inquiry had happened, and journalism was largely reviled as a profession. And I wanted to look at that, but at the same time, I wanted to depict a version of him that was far more sort of psychologically plausible, that was more realistic. And so I kind of I wrote three in a row. It was the first time I've done that about him,
Hmm.
and really just kind of got under the skin and asked myself what would actually motivate someone like that. Because you don't stop to ask yourself that when you're writing something as knockabout as Quite Ugly One Morning.
And also, Quite Ugly One Morning was a success as a debut. So I guess that would keep him in your mind, I suppose.
Though certainly there wasn't any great pressure from the publishers to keep writing about
Right.
him.
Okay.
When I think what tended to happen was, like with Country of the Blind, I come up with an idea, um, and realised very quickly there was a place in it for him. And that happened a lot. At times I'd come up with an idea and think that he wouldn't be in it, and then I'd realise actually he would fit. Um, but frequently that wouldn't be the case. It's always the story first. So Black Widow I conceived as a Jasmine Sharp novel, and then realised that he was actually more appropriate and he would be better to be in that. So it's always the story first. I've never thought, right, I'm writing a Parlabane novel now, I need to come up with a plot.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I mean, because I think of him as being the central character in these novels, obviously is, but character driven, I guess, is what I'm getting at. But it's the story it's the plot which you're really interested in.
I think, yeah, for most, not so much that it's just what I'm interested in. Certainly the early books, it was wanting to address some issue that I would get my teeth into, whether it was the relationship between church and state in Boiling a Frog, or um, the conduct of or the investigations into the paranormal and Attack of the Unsinkable Rubber Duck. So I wanted the issue to be fairly central to it, and it helped that I had a character that could investigate things, and his own background wasn't particularly pertinent. And I think that's like short code to the reader to say we're going to be writing about these issues and not slow things down by talking about this character's own baggage. But as the years went on, I get more interested in what would make a character like that tick. So something like the Dead Girl Walking, Black Widow, and Want You Gone were far more character driven, in that they were about what made Parlabane who he is, and
Mhm.
about the relationships that he was having. But they were still driven by a plot idea. And with the latest Quite Ugly One Evening, I think it's the one that's been most driven by Parlabane's character in terms of I spent a long time on that, what is a fairly complex plot, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of layers to that. But I wanted it to be a book about him examining himself as he approaches the age of 60 and examining the choices he's made in his life. So it is fairly character driven,
Yeah,
more
because
so than previous ones.
it is partly about aging and that whole period of life where you start to perhaps you think you've got less ahead of you than you have behind you.
Yeah, it's a time in life for taking stock. You can't help but do that, and various things precipitate it. I mean, in my case, my son growing up and moving out, that caused my wife Marisa and I to you take stock of where you are, what you want, because when you become parents, it takes over everything, and 20 years pass before you can actually say, what does I actually want to do with my life? And in Parlabane's case, it's spoiler sensitive, but something happens that precipitates a big moment of reflection for him.
Yeah.
And he, therefore, in this book, it's about him asking, one, was it worth pouring so much of my energy into this career? Because the career is journalism, which it seems to be in a permanent state of crisis, but at the same time, it's a book that shows you how valuable journalism is. But it's also about him realizing that he doesn't have a family, really. He doesn't have a wife anymore. He never had kids. And so it's about him reevaluating the choices he's made.
There's a lovely moment, which isn't a spoiler, I don't think, but where he's literally reflecting, he's looking at his own reflection in the mirror, and it's a mirror he would have looked at as a child.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a lovely moment, and kind of brings home this idea that he is aging, but then you then throw him into some real a tricky to call it a tricky situation is underestimating it. Can you talk a bit about the setting of the book, and we'll get into some more details there.
Yeah, he's on gardening leave essentially, because he's overstepped the mark again, got himself into a real mess, and he's in desperate need of a win. So his judgment is not the best. He accepts an assignment that he knows he shouldn't accept, that he knows is a poison chalice. There's someone from the intelligence services is asking him to kind of do some work off the books incognito and look into the death of an intelligence agent 40 years before, which they suspect have been murder, but they need someone who is essentially expendable, I think, to go in and be unsuspected. And the agent was investigating or was working close to a very high profile family, this media family. And this family, they're called the Maskin family, and they're best known, or they've been living off the fortune made by the patriarch and sort of matriarch of the family, who in the 60s devised this quite trippy psychedelic children's adventure puppet show called the Imaginators. It's something, if you think of something like Thunderbirds, but definitely more trippy than that, maybe like Thunderbirds meets HP Puffin stuff or something like that, and it's something that has kept them in money for decades because the legacy of it has still brought in a certain amount. Maybe not as much as it did once upon a time, which is why the family is already got big fault lines in terms of who's controlling things and what direction they want to take it. But the Imaginators has enjoyed a sudden resurgence in international popularity due to a role-playing game that's kind of been played online by high-profile people. But this has led to the possibility of a reboot. But people have also noticed that the values and the imagery of this program hasn't aged well in some cases. So they're talking about revising it to make it less racist and just more palatable to modern sensibilities. And this has been seized upon by the culture warriors, by the anti-woke crusaders who are having these performative tantrums to say that this show meant so much to so many people, and now you're creating a travesty of it in the name of political correctness. So it's become a fault line, but that's only boosted its profile. And that's the kind of lie of the land. We now need to talk about the lie of the sea, really, which is that there's a it's 60 years since this programme was first aired, and there's a convention to celebrate that, but it's taking place on a transatlantic crossing. So it's a cruise ship, very high spec, loosely based on the Queen Mary 2.
Right.
So it's very classy, apart from all the people going around dressed in puppet show merch. And so Parlabane finds himself on a ship he can't get off of with thousands of fanboys who would be weird enough in their obsession with it in the 1960s puppet show. But to add to that, you've got this culture wars fault line. So you've got people in tacky t-shirts and MAGA hats, and you've got other people who are there just because they love the show and they don't want the whole culture war thing to be happening. And Parlabane finds himself at one point in a locked stateroom with a dead person, and he's got to work out who really killed this person before the ship reaches New York. Otherwise, he's going down for it because he's covered in this dead person's DNA and vice versa.
This idea of like not just throwing people together, but they cannot leave. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a locked room mystery, but it's a locked boat. You know,
yeah.
there is a way off, but not really.
Well, it's the locked room mystery. Is very much about who was there in one place at one time. But what the ship gives you is the fact that you can't really introduce new elements. You know, nothing's there that wasn't there when it set sail, with the exception of one person who flies there on a helicopter. But then there's a point at which the ship's out of helicopter range, and that's when everything goes really chaotic. So I like the idea of something self-contained like that. I've done that before with One Fine Day in the Middle of the Night, for instance, where it was a self-contained holiday resort on an oil rig. And this is a similar situation in that nobody can get off really, and it means you've got this sort of classic murder mystery where it's who done it and how could they have left this body in this room. So I really quite enjoyed doing that. It's quite old fashioned in a way,
Yeah.
in a way that I generally haven't written before.
Are you a fan of cruises? Is that something you know well?
I've been on one, and that played a part in inspiring this. It was Marisa and I my wife Marisa Haetzman and I write as Ambrose Parry, and we got the biggest perk of our careers, I think, when we got invited aboard the Cheltenham at Sea Literature Festival. And that's a 1 week voyage crossing the Atlantic where the entertainment on the cruise is this great literature festival. So
Wow.
you get paid to go. You know, you sing for your supper, you do several events, workshops, but you get to hang out with a great group of writers. You get to go and see all these fantastic literary discussions, and all of which was offsetting for me, the fact that I didn't like the concept of being cooped up on a boat I couldn't get off of, and also offsetting or only partially offsetting the constant awareness that you're in the middle of the Atlantic, you know, that instant death is over the other side of a rail. And so before we travelled, they booked you on this 18 months in advance. So I had a long time to think about what was coming, and that kind of led to me coming up with this idea. So it wasn't that I wrote it after being on the ship. I mean, I did, but I mean, I'd been working on it, and I waited until I'd been on the ship so that I knew what it actually felt like. And that was a wise decision because there's so many small but important elements of the atmosphere of it, or the mechanics and practicalities of it, that I wouldn't have been able to anticipate.
Yeah, there's lots of details such as how it works in eating arrangements and sleeping arrangements and things like that, which suggested that you were familiar with that world anyway. Just out of interest, what were the audiences like on that literary cruise?
Well, for one thing, they were big for the most part. You know, it's because everything's laid on. But what was strange was obviously the Times were involved in their sponsors of it, and so they were advertising it as a package for a year and a half. They always do because it runs every year. So there's a lot of people were there for that, but you know, two or three times as many people were unaware until they got on the ship that this was taking place, and many of them to their great delight. You know, they had no idea this was going to be going on. So, which is a great chance to get new readers, but it meant that, for instance, every morning the first event was a kind of chat about the morning's newspapers.
Right.
It was full every morning. There's in this big, well, the two very big auditoriums, and this one of them was the planetarium, and the larger one was the theatre. But they both held quite a sizable audience. And so, as I say, every day that was standing room only, and the other events would be very well attended. Which was, you know, hugely pleasing. You're a writer, you walk out on stage and it's a big crowd.
So they didn't necessarily influence the kind of cosplayers that are on
Oh no,
Jack's
no,
boat.
no. I think I had this notion that I always like to treat Parlabane quite badly, so I thought, why don't I put him on? I mean, this cruise was a literary cruise, was just the perfect environment for me. So I thought, why don't I put him on somewhere that would be absolutely hellish? You know, let's have it be something absurd. And the cosplay thing and the puppet thing was, it was partly because I wanted to say, what's the daftest, most seemingly innocent and inconsequential thing that could nonetheless end up being used by grifters and culture warriors to really just to put themselves in the spotlight. You know, to me, it seemed there was nothing that people wouldn't create some sort of spat over. So that's why I thought, let's make it something really daft, like a 60s puppet show. And so there was that gave me things that other notions might not. At one point, I entertained the idea of what if it was a sort of political conference, not party political, but, you know, conference or a festival of political journalism or memoir or something. And I thought, no, make it really stupid and make it something really daft. And then that brought in elements like the fact that people turn up in cosplay, or people wear T-shirts showcasing the ideologically problematic elements of it because they're trying to provoke a reaction. And also it meant I could write about things like why culturally some things resonate. So with the Imaginators, I was thinking about things like Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet, obviously, but it wasn't just the TV shows. That there's a generation of us that grew up with those toys,
Yeah.
dinky toys. And so when people become very attached, if something's a part of their childhood, they get really defensive if you somehow suggest there's something unwholesome about it. So it just seemed, I think you kick around a lot of ideas and suddenly you realise you're on a good one. So the sort of puppet show just stuck.
And I think actually the kind of stupidity of it, if you like, about it being a child's TV show, absolutely chimes with the current times. It made me think of the response to some of the most recent Star Wars movies
Yeah,
and how
yeah,
that divided people incredibly. And you're like that. This was a show I saw when I was 7, and
yeah.
why are you getting so involved with this?
Yeah, I think I was aware that it's a combination of people's genuine passion and some cynical people exploiting that passion. You know, so it's one thing for someone to get upset because they don't like the direction that the new Star Wars is going, or they don't like who the new Doctor Who is.
Yeah.
But you can add this toxic element by saying, yeah, this is the woke mind virus is inspecting everything, you know, and telling people that the new iteration of a show they like is an existential threat to them rather than just something they might or might not enjoy.
And if it perceives to have failed, the kind of like we have won this, and like what have you won?
Yeah,
What have you won? There's nothing to
yeah,
it.
I guess that's the book does deal with that element of the culture wars. To me, it's encapsulated very well by James O'Brien, called it the footballification of politics, where people are encouraged to see it as like their team, and they're encouraged to see things as a victory for their team, regardless of whether the implications of that decision or that policy is actually damaging to them.
Yeah.
You know, they're encouraged to cheer a result that goes against their own best interests because it owns the libs, because it scores something for their team. I mean, a good example was that when Dominic Cumming got away with all his lying about Barnard Castle, I remember at the time lots of conservative types on social media saying, "Yeah, this really annoys you because he winds you a lot up." And you're thinking he has just hugely damaged public confidence in the government at one of the most vulnerable times for our society, but you're cheering this as a win because it annoyed people you don't like.
Yeah.
And that to me is that what the culture war's there to serve, is to serve cynical people's agendas. It's not about Star Wars, it's not about the Imaginators, it's about some very evil people, and that's what the book ultimately exposes.
Yeah, because it seems to me, and it stops any kind of conversation or discussion, because if you don't agree with me on one thing, then you
Yeah,
don't agree with me on anything, and that's
that's it. We're encouraged to see each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens. And so if you disagree on one issue, instead of saying, well, I disagree with that, but we've got so much more in common, and instead it's telling people to ignore the things they've got in common. And that's ultimately what the book is about, that a family that's lost sight of all the things they've got in common because they've been driven apart initially by sort of financial pressures and ambitions, but also they've been driven apart by the culture war as well. So it's a book about how there has to be a lot of reconciliation. It's a book about seeing that we've got more in common than we have divided.
And was that because you mentioned earlier on that often you like to there's something that's under your skin and you want to look deeper into it, and this time around, was that it, the culture war?
Very much so. I felt like I didn't want to be going into any specific issue of it. It was more like how it's implemented. That troubled me, to see that it was that the way politics was being participated in at a quite superficial level through
Yeah.
social media, and that encouraging people not to look at the issues, not to look at the implications, but to see it as a cheerleading exercise. And I wanted to get into that. I felt like it's the kind of book that Parlabane is an appropriate character
Yeah.
to interrogate.
Yeah, because he's a cynical person, and he's quite right to be cynical about what's going on this boat.
Yeah,
Um, Sorry.
I thought he's the type of person who'd be massively annoyed by all the type of people he would encounter, and that creates a tension and a humour. But it's also about him realising what he has in common unexpectedly with whether it's the Imaginators fans or even with the Maskin family. It's about him reevaluating his own prejudices. So it's very much ultimately it's quite a warm-hearted book, especially for a Parlabane novel.
And you mentioned humour there. There's always humour in your novels, at least often very dark. But I was wondering, do you have comedy heroes? I mean, I think you mentioned Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy earlier on, but are there writers or even other areas of comedy that inspire you?
I grew up with comedy. I think when I wrote Quite Ugly One Morning, it was an indication that my sense of narrative voice was as much influenced by stand-ups as it was by novelists. So I grew up with obviously Billy Connolly. Um, in the days before we had even videos, I'd last thing at night, I'd just fall asleep listening to cassettes of Billy Connolly albums. But also, I would record off the TV before we had a video. Things like Mike Harding or Jasper Carrott, or people who would tell us a narrative story, a sort of rambling story. And I was a big fan of Bill Hicks.
Mhm.
I like the comedian who would really drill down into a subject rather than just tell a couple of one-liners. So I've always had that element of the stand-up in the back of my head, that kind of meter to the writing. Was probably why all these years later on, my son is now a stand-up.
But importantly, it's the storytelling aspect of the stand-up. Connolly's a great example, and so is Jasper Carrott, rather than the gag telling.
Yeah, yeah, it's that, well, the ability to make a story funny, and but the narrative element that takes you along with it. That I think that always I've never been. It's not that I'm not a big fan of the sort of feedline punchline comedian, but you can't take much of it.
Yeah.
10, 15 minutes tops. and then there's no structure. Whereas I think I suppose it's like the oral storytelling tradition manifest in a really good stand-up who can tell you a story but pepper it with humour, pepper it with witty observations.
You've reminded me actually talking about the Billy Connolly cassettes. The cassettes were often kind of passed around the school playground. Have you heard this one? Derek and Clive
Yeah,
was another one which was kind of really, oh, we shouldn't be listening to this, but have you
yeah,
heard this
yeah.
type of thing? And going back to how you were feeling when you write the novel, and maybe other ones as well, are you angry about what you're writing about? Is it therapeutic in a way to kind of examine it on the page?
I think it's all those things. There's an element of anger has always driven the Parlabane novels because there's usually something that I'm angry about and I want to have my say. In the early days, I was very forthright in having my say, and I think now I'm more inclined to look at why I feel angry and try and analyze that a bit more even-handedly. So to that extent, I think the making sense of it is a big part of it. It's therapeutic in that it feels chaotic. You're sort of frustrated by whatever's going on culturally or ideologically, and it's a really long exercise in asking, well, what is it that's bothering you about this, and what would improve it? So I'm trying to make sense of it by rendering it all in a narrative, and I think that by the end of a novel, I feel like I understand the issue better because I've spent so long meditating on it and trying to construct something that made sense. And I think that's what we like as readers. We take the world of chaos, and if there's a story that takes some element of our everyday reality and orders it in a way that makes some sense, that can be quite reassuring. It's certainly therapeutic for me because the things that annoy me, it's not that they're not going to annoy me anymore, but I feel more inclined to, I'm a wee bit calmer about it because I know where it's all coming from.
And we said that Jack has kind of changed as a character over the years. Have you changed as a writer over the years, or how have you changed as a writer over the years? Is probably a better way of saying it.
I think it was as an exercise to come back to Parlabane after a while was this seemed the right time, and I was conscious that it was going to be 30 years since the first novel, so I thought it's a good time to look at to write about Parlabane again. But I was determined to write about him in a way that was similar in tone to the first book because I've become more serious as a writer as the years have gone on. Um, I think the early books were very knockabout, and I'm quite envious of that writer that I was in
Right.
my 20s. When you're so confident and you're not full of self-doubt, and this type of satire I could write back then. Whereas now, something that struck me as absurd back then, now I think, oh, it does strike me as absurd superficially, but there'll be an explanation for that, and I want to drill down into the explanation, which can make for some interesting stuff, but definitely not as funny. So my instinct is always these days to be a bit more analytical, a bit more even-handed. But I'm jealous of that earlier writer. So I think with Quite Ugly One Evening, I was determined to come back to that tone at least of irreverence and playfulness, which kind of came out of writing The Cracked Mirror as well, because for all the Cracked Mirrors got a lot of layers to it and a lot of depth to it. It was a playful book. It was supposed to be a
Yeah.
fun read. So I was determined that if I wrote about Parlabane again, it would be closer to the Parlabane of the first book. But obviously, I'm a lot more mature as a writer now, and he's more mature as a character. So it has to be about how you're not quite so sure of yourself. You're beset by doubt, and that's a healthy thing.
It's Parlabane in part you on the page, a cipher for you on the page. He's reflecting now over the 30 years. It sounds like you are too.
There's elements of that's always going to be the case. I think he was in the early days. He was very much a kind of a vehicle for all the things you wish you could say, you wish you had a platform for, or that you wish you could say. But as time's gone on, actually, I've sort of distanced myself from or used them so that I would have him do things or say things I would never do or say, and realise that I would never do or say them, and I'm right and he's wrong. And I think that's the in the early days you'd think, oh, I wish I was as ballsy as him, and now I'm at the stage where I think, well, he can be ballsy in a really foolhardy way. So that I'm that distance between the two of us is something I can use as a writer a bit more skillfully than I did way back then. I
And
suppose in a way, there was a bit of an epiphany. I realised that when I'd written the first few books about Parlabane and people were really on board with his opinions and his forthright manner, and I made that work when I wrote A Big Boy Did It and Ran Away. I came up with this villain, Simon Darcourt, and when you first meet him, he's ranting about stuff, and it's quite seductive. You know, you're invited to agree with him, and you probably do agree with him for the first few pages of things he's saying, and then you gradually, the more you get to know him, you realise, oh my God, this guy's a psychopath. So it was an exercise of turning that on its head to realise you are inviting the reader to identify with your protagonist, so you can subvert that. But the lesson I learned from that is that you can subvert that even when it's your good guy like Jack Parlabane, you're a positive protagonist. So I'm not quite as aligned with them as I once was.
Do you enjoy kind of playing with readers' expectations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that keeps it exciting. I've always drawn the comparison to crime fiction and stage magic. I mean, I'd never have the dexterity or the time to perfect that, but it's a similar thrill. You enjoy the thrill of misdirecting the reader, fooling the reader. You enjoy subverting their expectations so that the story goes in a place they don't anticipate, but hopefully the resolution is something they don't anticipate, but that it feels satisfying.
And I guess, going back to stand-up comedy, there's an aspect to that too.
Yeah.
Because if you knew where the stories were going, then you wouldn't really want to be on the ride.
Yeah, jokes, magic tricks, and crime fiction are all very similar in their mechanics. What's said about a good twist in the resolution of a novel is that it should be surprising but inevitable. And it's similar to like a joke. The end should be surprising but inevitable in that you realise there was the logic you were following is slightly the wrong train of logic, and now that the right train of logic's been revealed, that's funny. You know, so there's someone once described all humour as the sudden perception of a void, but it's really, I think it's actually the sudden perception of the correct answer when you were looking in the wrong place.
And like a magic trick, you don't necessarily want to know how it works, because that ruins the whole thing.
No, I mean there's some of us. I remember seeing a magician last year, and he was saying that about half the audience would just want to be mystified, and half the audience want to know how it's done. And I've got a foot in both camps. I mean, I can really just enjoy being mystified, but there's a curious part of me always wants to know what was the mechanic. Whether that's, you can see it in crime fiction because you realise where it was you were supposed to look. Stage magic, they guard their secrets much more clearly.
And you said that you've become more analytical as a writer, and I'm wondering if that's in part to do with you being involved with the Ambrose Parry novels, written, as you said, with your wife Marisa. You know, we've spoken about that before and how there was almost split roles there, but is that the case, that that's kind of fed your own analytic way of writing?
It's certainly changed how I write. I mean, I've always been quite sort of self-analytical as a writer as the years have gone on, but certainly when you're writing in a collaborative way, you're always discussing what it is you're trying to do. You're always discussing what the motives are of your characters and what the themes are, why those themes fit the story you're trying to tell. So that bleeds over naturally into when I'm writing on my own.
And I guess going back to the idea of partly wanting to know how the magic trick's done and just be enjoying it, do you enjoy solving the problems? What I mean is, do you enjoy putting Jack, in this case, into situations as a challenge to yourself as much as to him? How's he going to get out of this?
Yeah, there's a great pleasure in creating these conundrums, these situations, and not necessarily knowing when you set them how you're going to resolve them. But that's something that Marisa and I, in the early books, Marisa would get far more stressed about it. And I'd say, look, she'd say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to resolve that? And I'd say, I don't know yet. And she was like furious. And how can you not know? You know, you've embarked upon this without knowing. And I would say, look, it's once you've spent time with the characters and the world you've created, you'll see a resolution. You'll see how it has to be. And now she's far more relaxed about that. And as am I. You kind of have to wait and be surprised, but creating I suppose sometimes if you're creating some sort of seemingly impossible puzzle, you need to know the answer to that before you write page one. I think we're all been let down by books with a great premise, and then you realise, oh, they fudged it because they didn't really have a clever solution to the seemingly intractable Gordian knot that drew you in the first place. So I would never do that. When it comes to the how Parlabane was going to get out of that stateroom, for instance, I wrote that halfway through the book because it takes place. Takes place at the start, then flashes back. But I think it's important to know enough about your story, but not too much.
And go back to the Imaginators. Was that enjoyable to kind of think about, your own childhood television and bring it to life, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's what was interesting to me was realizing that I was looking back to the things that meant something to me when I was younger, but also that they had resonated beyond that. So, like when my son was a child, he was very into the Jerry Anderson stuff, and he probably saw more of it than I did because by the time he was that age, it was easy to get everything on DVD. So he was able to see every episode. Whereas when you were growing up, you might see one episode of something and then find out that the series had finished, and then but you played with the toys, but you couldn't actually get to see the content quite easily. But it stayed with you. So it was fun to create that world and think, well, what about that world would resonate, and not just write about a world that was obviously Thunderbirds or obviously UFO or something. I thought something's. I mean, I had to take a lot of it out because I wrote so much more about the content of the Imaginators, but it would just slow the plot down. But you sometimes have to do that. You have to create this world and not show the reader everything you've created. You just have to give them glimpses of it so that they get a sense there's more beyond what's been on the page.
I think your reference of Doctor Who is a really interesting one because they're often, the old ones are now, in fact, there's whole channels now that show a lot of the stuff kind of run about the time you've set these in. I was watching Avengers the other day with Steed, the original Avengers way back. And one, I've forgotten how weird it is for a start. And also that a lot of the channels that show this older stuff, there's often warnings at the beginning saying this were, language used and attitudes off the day, which is sort of what you're saying. Some people are maybe go because they enjoy those attitudes and language of the day.
Well, it's interesting bringing up some of the Avengers because when I was thinking about the Imaginators, I was thinking about how those shows, they were not necessarily pitched entirely as kids shows. Sometimes they were sort of family shows, some of the Jerry Anderson ones, but things like the Avengers and the New Avengers and Jason King and Department S, they were trippy. There was a weirdness to them that it wasn't saying, wasn't even like a sort of implausibility like James Bond was implausible. It was almost advertising this is not the real world. This is pseudo science fiction, which added something to it. I think that's what I wanted to hark back to, that this was a time when the sort of storytelling values were different, but so were the kind of visual cues. And so that weird trippiness was something I wanted to bring to it. Not that adds to the ideological aspect of it or anything. It was just to say the flavours were very different back then. So yes, everything was different, and therefore some of the values would have been acceptable in the same way you wouldn't have questioned how weird the programme was back then, but you would now. You say, bloody hell, look, that's really strange.
Well, I was thinking about children's television, young children's television, and I thought about the Singing Ringing Tree. You remember the Singing Ringing Tree? The really odd, I think it was Czech, maybe it was certainly Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Some of that stuff was disturbing.
Really disturbing. And there was a man dressed clearly dressed in a bear suit. And you think, it was character building, perhaps, looking back on it. And talking about TV, Quite Ugly One Morning was adapted for television, wasn't it?
Back in 2004.
Yeah. There's been never a chat about doing anything else with Parlabane on telly or film.
Yeah, a lot. There was an attempt by Blazing Griffin in Glasgow where they were working on Black Widow for a long time, and then because was 20 years since the TV adaptation, the rights to Quite Ugly One Morning came back, and there was a lot of interest last summer. So then ultimately it's STV Productions who bought the option, and they've been in talks with various writers. I hope to catch up with them soon. So their plan is to build a whole load of series around Parlabane. So it's still early days, but it is in development. And actually, one of the companies that was trying to get Quite Ugly One Morning, and they didn't get it, so they actually went away and came back and made an offer for the Angelique Desavia books. So they're
Right.
developing those. So a whole lot of stuff suddenly got kind of precipitated because the rights to Quite Ugly One Morning became free again after 2 decades.
Is that something that sort of happens, that one thing will maybe have a knock-on effect?
Yeah, I mean, Marissa likes to, she keeps saying, when people ask about all the things that are in development, and so many of my novels and her novels are in development, but Marissa always says nothing ever gets made. But I think what we always feel is you sometimes see with a writer, nothing's been made, then one thing gets made, and suddenly everybody wants to make something. So we keep hoping that that first domino will fall.
And we are finding Jack in a reflective mood, looking back over his life. Is there something next for him? Do you know? Can you say?
Oh, I have no idea what. As I said before, a story finds me and I decide it's time to bring him back. But we've got a new Ambrose Parry book that we've recently delivered, so that'll be out next year. And I've got a project that I'm working on that will be my next solo book, and it's definitely not a Parlabane novel. So I don't know when he'll be back, and that's always the answer I've got after I've finished pretty much any Parlabane book.
You mentioned that the Cracked Mirror, which was a stunning novel, um, but incredibly complex. Is that something that you might return to, any of those characters, or again you don't
No,
know?
no.
No.
That was that was the hardest book I've ever written, and I'm never going back there. It's the book I'm most proud of. It's a lot of fun, but it was so difficult, and trying to come up with the scenario for a sequel would be. I mean, there's an easy way to have a sequel to it, but I couldn't let myself do that. So no, I'm not going back there.
I'm glad this is on video, Chris, because the look in your face when I suggested that was like, oh no, no, no. And you mentioned that part of the inspiration for the setting on this latest novel was because you were on a festival on the boat, and we're coming into a lot of festivals as we speak. Paisley's coming up at the weekend, book festival, and then obviously we've got Bloody Scotland later in the year. Do you enjoy festivals, crime festivals, and the book festivals?
Oh, massively. Yeah, all book festivals. I think I always did, but I remember when the pandemic struck, Doug Johnston saying that it was only at that point he realised how much of his social life revolved around book festivals. And you realise there's a point in life where, when you're first a writer, you realise you know a few writers, but you still got all your wider circle of friends. As the years go on, more and more of your friends are just other writers, and so that's when you catch up with them. But also, you spend all year, well, not all year, but you spend a big chunk of the dark months
Yeah.
cooped up writing your book, and then you get to go out and talk to people about your book and see what they thought of it, and you also get to hear about other books. So this is one of the things Marissa and I talk about, how much we enjoy the summer, because it is just kind of like one festival after another, and it gets you in places you wouldn't expect to travel sometimes. We did the Collinsay Book Festival a couple of weeks ago, and that was a lovely weekend, not somewhere you'd naturally find yourself. So it's something we both greatly enjoy.
There seems to have been in the last few years, maybe a decade or more, a real explosion in book festivals. I'm often talking to people who will say, "Oh, I'm off to the wherever," and I had no idea there was a festival there. They can be small one day, but it's
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
thriving.
yeah. It's brilliant. I think post-pandemic as well. I think people have got a renewed appreciation for actually going and sitting in a room with a crowd and hearing what a novelist has to say. What we're valuing the live experience more than we did before.
Mhm.
And I think that's the uniqueness of it, of actually going and seeing an author in conversation rather than just their words on the page. Certainly, my impression is that book festivals are thriving like never before.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, it's always my pleasure too.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.